Mason Reed limped across the obsidian floor, each step echoing like a challenge in the cavernous silence. The hall was impossibly large, its walls alive with bioluminescent veins that pulsed a dull violet. High above, skeletal arches of alien architecture converged around the throne, an enormous ridged spire, formed from what looked disturbingly like fused bone. Perched atop it, the Queen of the Zaltari did not blink. Of course, she didn't. Her species didn't have eyelids. Mason adjusted the translator on his collar, already aware it wouldn't save him from misunderstanding. Ceremonial summonses weren't uncommon during the Human-Zaltari alliance talks, but he wasn't a diplomat. He was a 17-year-old Earth-born corporal with a healing limp, a dull silver medal on his chest, and scars that still itched in the cold. He stopped 12 feet from the throne. That was as close as anyone was allowed, according to the briefing he'd barely understood. The guards lining the walls, their armor resembling polished obsidian and reptilian hide, watched him with expressions unreadable. A smaller figure approached from the side dais, the Queen's speaker, or at least the nearest approximation of one. Mason never quite got how that worked, whether it was a telepathic relay or just some sort of ceremonial ventriloquism. The Zaltari were apex predators, known for their brute strength, territorial savagery, and inflexible social hierarchy. What they weren't known for was curiosity. So, when the speaker gestured toward Mason's chest and asked in perfect monotone English through the translator, "What is the meaning of the adornment you wear?" It wasn't small talk. The Queen's gaze locked on the silver medallion pinned above his left pocket, the Earth Defense Medal, shaped like a crescent laid across a shield, half burnished from age, half scratched from impact. Mason instinctively reached up and tapped it once with his knuckles. "This?" he said, voice hoarse from the dry air. "I got this for surviving Europa." A hush rolled across the chamber, like wind through a dead forest. The Zaltari rarely showed emotion, but something shifted. Heads turned. Even the guards tilted forward a fraction. The Queen leaned imperceptibly closer. "Explain." Mason blinked. His leg throbbed 2 fractures in the fibula, nearly healed but still tender. The pressure suit chafed, the support wrap under his uniform was itching like hell, and standing this long already made his ribs ache. But he could feel it, the tension. Not hostility. Not reverence, either. Something closer to calculation. He drew a breath, shallow and careful. "It started 3 months ago," he said. "Back on Europa Station, Delta 7. We were stationed there during the second wave of incursions." And suddenly, the throne room melted away. The corridor stank of melted insulation and scorched metal. Alarms howled in pulses. Mason was face down on the floor when the first blast hit, his ears ringing so hard it took several seconds to register the fire crawling up the wall behind him. He rolled over with a grunt, his breath catching as pain flared across his side. His ribs had taken a hit, maybe cracked. He couldn't tell. He checked his squad, what was left of it. Corporal Jin was half pinned under a collapsed beam. Private Andrews was clutching his arm, blood pouring between his fingers. Mason could hear screaming down the hall closer than it should have been. The enemy was boarding. Not a Zaltari force. No, these were something else. Some smaller species the Zaltari had refused to name. Fast, ruthless. Hit-and-run types with blades and cloaking gear. The Alliance didn't even have a proper classification yet. His commander was dead. That meant Mason was in charge. He remembered the panic, raw and loud in his chest. And then nothing but focus. He dragged Jin out from under the beam, every movement making his side throb like a drumbeat. He used a utility knife to cut away Andrews' sleeve, wrapped the arm with thermoplast mesh. Then he started pulling them both back toward the emergency bulkhead, knowing the medbay was nearly 100 meters away. Halfway there, the boarding party breached. They came through the wall like liquid shadow, all knives and red optics. Mason had 3 shots left in his sidearm. He used them, then slammed his palm into the override panel to seal the corridor behind him. It wasn't enough. He ducked into a side room and equipment bay. Improvised, grabbed a fuel cell and a roll of adhesive charges. His breath was ragged now, hot with blood in the back of his throat. Still, he wired the charges, set the timer, propped the fuel cell as a directional blast, and waited. When they came through the door, Mason was already rolling behind a reinforced crate. The explosion sent half the squad tumbling in pieces. The other half scattered. That gave him 10 more minutes. enough to carry both wounded into the access shaft and signal for evac. He didn't remember much after that, except the medics cutting his armor off and yelling something about his lung. Back in the throne room, Mason fell silent. He hadn't meant to say so much. The story came out clipped, without embellishment. Not even a hint of drama. Just facts. His voice cracked once, when he mentioned Jin, how they lost him on the shuttle later. Cardiac arrest from internal bleeding. He didn't dwell on it, just nodded once. The Zaltari said nothing. Not a sound, not a breath. Even the speaker stood still, his head slightly bowed. Mason shifted, wincing. The Queen's eyes hadn't moved. They were the color of deep magma, impossibly old, impossibly calm. At last, a warrior near the side, a tall, scar-slicked brute with ceremonial armor and a weapon across his back, stepped forward. He'd scoffed earlier, Mason remembered. Now, he lowered himself to one knee, followed by another. And another. The speaker turned, waiting for the Queen. When she finally moved, it was only a flick of her hand, an elegant gesture that somehow silenced the room further. Then came her voice. Not from her mouth, but through the speaker. It was low and absolute. "We did not summon you to entertain." Mason straightened slightly, unsure. "You wear that medal as a badge of survival," she said, "and I understand now why it was given." He didn't reply. There was nothing to say. She gestured again, and the floor lit up beneath Mason's feet. Symbols formed alien, glowing, a diplomatic seal, one that marked him not as a soldier, but as a recognized emissary. "You will speak with our war sages," the Queen continued. "Your actions will be studied, not for their savagery, for their refusal to end." Mason blinked. His ribs ached more now, deep and gnawing. "May I sit down?" he asked quietly. There was a pause. Then the Queen gave a slow, deliberate nod. And in the great throne hall of the apex predators, the boy with a limp sat down, metal glinting in the alien light, while predators bowed. Mason sat stiffly on the curved bench. They brought him something between a seat and a ceremonial platform, its surface slightly too high for comfort and too smooth to trust. But sitting helped. The pain in his ribs had settled into a steady grind, dulled by the painkillers still in his bloodstream from that morning. They didn't erase pain, just made it manageable, mostly. Across the grand chamber, the Queen had not moved, nor had most of the court. Only the warriors flanking the perimeter had shifted positions, stepping back into loose half-circles formation, reverence, or both. One of them, a taller Zaltari with angular plating along his shoulders, approached and placed a round object at Mason's feet. The translator hummed quietly. "This is water," said the speaker, "filtered for your physiology." Mason blinked and picked up the vessel. It was warm. A sip confirmed it metallic. But water. His voice was hoarse from the dry air, and the fluid soothed the burn in his throat. He nodded, murmuring thanks, unsure if the words would mean anything. Apparently, they did. The Queen made a gesture again, this one more complex, something layered. The speaker stepped forward, arms folded behind his back. "There is conflict," he said slowly, "among the sages. They do not understand your choices." Mason looked up. "What choices?" "You chose not to flee. You chose not to abandon the injured. You chose pain over survival." The boy gave a small, humorless breath. "Yeah, I guess I did." "Explain." Mason looked down at the floor, where the glowing symbols were slowly fading into dim lines. "It wasn't a decision I made all at once," he said. "It's not like I sat down and waited out. We were trained to watch each other's backs. If someone gets hurt, you don't leave them. It's not just orders, it's instinct, habit. And..." He hesitated. "It's guilt, too. If I'd run and they died, I'd have to carry that forever." The speaker tilted his head. "You speak of guilt, as if that is more powerful than fear." "It is," Mason said quietly. "It can be." The room absorbed the words. Again, the silence returned, but this time, it felt less like a test, and more like awe, or confusion wearing its armor. "Fear keeps you alive," the speaker said. "This we understand. But this guilt, this choosing, pain to avoid memory, this is alien to us." Mason didn't answer right away. His leg was starting to ache again, and he subtly shifted his weight, pressing one palm to his thigh. "Well, that's kind of the thing, isn't it?" he muttered. "We're not here because we're stronger, or smarter. You've got tech that could vaporize a city in seconds. We've just got Stubbornness. The kind that makes you keep going even when everything hurts, even when it doesn't make sense. The chamber lights dimmed a fraction, signaling the arrival of a new group. 6 Zaltari warriors in ceremonial armor strode forward, each adorned with different patterns along their exosuits, bone-colored ridges spiraling upward like trophies. They were the war sages. Mason had read about them in the briefing file. Not generals, not politicians. These were survivors of 1,000 battles. Veterans. Living military doctrine. They stood in a crescent formation before him. One stepped forward and circled slowly, appraising Mason with open scrutiny. No one spoke until the Queen gave a curt nod. The foremost sage stepped close, closer than anyone had yet dared approach Mason. His eyes were pale and slitted, his voice unusually quiet. "You said the medics removed your armor and found damage to your lung," the translator echoed. "What was the treatment protocol?" Mason blinked, surprised by the clinical question. He answered anyway. Left lung was partially collapsed. They did needle decompression on the shuttle, then a tube thoracostomy when we got to the ship. I was in intensive care for 4 days. Then surgery to remove the fluid buildup. After that, rehab. One of the sages clicked his fingers, and the translator briefly garbled the noise before realigning. "You breathed through this pain while dragging 2 others?" Mason nodded. "I was half-conscious, mostly. I didn't do it all at once, just far enough to get them clear. You don't really think about pain in the moment. Later, yeah, you think a lot about it later." The sage turned. Another asked, "You mentioned using makeshift explosives. Did you have clearance to handle unstable fuel cells?" "No," Mason said. "Didn't think about clearance. Just knew it'd blow if you wired it right." "Why risk detonating something you had not tested?" "I wasn't trying to win. I just needed a delay." The sages paused. One exhaled a strange, almost reverent hiss. "You used uncertainty as a weapon." "I used what I had." "You accepted loss." Mason looked up sharply. "I didn't accept it," he said. "I just didn't let it stop me." The silence this time was different. The kind that settles in after a realization. The kind predators fall into when they recognize another apex, not of strength, but of something harder to define. One sage approached and, in a surprisingly gentle motion, extended a hand toward Mason's chest. He didn't touch the metal, just observed it. "We thought it decorative," he said. "We see now it is not reward, it is warning." Mason gave a tired laugh that turned into a wince. "Well, I won't argue with that." Later, when the court had dispersed and only a smaller gathering remained, Mason was led through a narrow corridor of woven crystal and dark steel. The Queen had summoned him again privately, this time. The room was smaller, more intimate, with thin plumes of mist rising from floor vents. The Queen sat lower now, closer to eye level. Mason stood straight as long as he could, then lowered himself with effort into the offered chair. "You will return to your species soon," the speaker said. "But first, the Queen will grant you something seldom given." Mason frowned. "I didn't come here for gifts." The Queen raised one clawed hand, and the speaker continued. "You misunderstand. This is not gratitude. It is classification." Mason blinked. "What kind of classification?" The Queen let out a low sound, not quite a growl. The speaker interpreted, "You are now recorded in our histories as Corvindar. It means, path that refuses to end. It is a term reserved for entities we do not challenge, not out of fear, out of recognition." Mason looked down at his hands. They were still scarred, still trembled occasionally when he pushed too hard. He wasn't fearless. Far from it. "I didn't do anything special," he said. "That is not your decision," the speaker replied. "It is ours." As Mason was escorted to the transport hangar, he passed the same hall he'd entered earlier that day. Only now, where he'd once walked alone, guards stood at solemn attention. Warriors saluted not in the Earth fashion, but with both arms crossed over their chests. His limp hadn't gotten better. The pressure wrap under his suit itched worse than ever. The ribs were healing slow, and his next rehab session was in 3 days back on the orbital medical base. But he walked straight back through the corridor of monsters. And not one predator met his eyes. By the time Mason stepped onto the human diplomatic vessel orbiting the Xaltari homeworld, his leg was on fire again. He didn't say anything, though. The medtech assigned to him, Lieutenant Aaron Hall, someone who looked only slightly older than him but carried herself like she'd wrestled gravity for breakfast, met him at the dock. "You're favoring the left side again," she said, without looking up from her tablet. Mason exhaled through his nose and leaned against the wall. Favoring implies it's a choice. She glanced up at his posture, eyes narrowing. You need imaging again. Could be stress on the healing fracture. I just sat through a 3-hour standoff with apex predators. I can live with a sore leg. Hall snapped her tablet shut. Good. Then you can walk to the medbay. He followed her, not because he wanted to, but because he knew arguing with her wasn't worth it. She was a good medic, brutally honest, no sugarcoating, but she also remembered every stat from his last recovery report. She'd been one of the first to treat him when he was airlifted off Europa. Saw the hole in his chest, heard the gurgling in his lungs. She didn't look at him like a hero, just another stubborn idiot who didn't die on time. In the medbay, she helped him ease off the exo support around his leg. The bruising was gone, but the swelling around the bone was still obvious. I'm ordering a scan, she said. Also, when's the last time you changed the dressing on your left flank? Mason winced. This morning, I think. You think, she repeated flatly. The scanner whirred to life beside him, and Mason stared at the ceiling tiles, letting the hum and click of the diagnostics fill the silence. He was more tired than he'd realized, not just physically. Bone deep, marrow deep tired. Vitals are stable, Hall said, checking the monitor. But your intercostal tissue's not healing as fast as we expected. You're probably irritating the scar every time you breathe heavy. Hard not to breathe heavy when your translator nearly fries during a direct audience with a reptilian monarch, Mason muttered. Hall didn't laugh. She was scanning a different set of numbers now. Still got residual infection markers. Low grade, but stubborn. We're going to adjust your antibiotics. He nodded without arguing. Any night pain? Mason nodded again. Nightmares? He hesitated. Yeah. Standard? No, these feel different. It's not the explosion or the blood. It's after. When I'm just sitting somewhere quiet. And I know everyone else didn't make it. Hall was quiet for a long moment. Memories like infection, she said finally. It doesn't flare up on schedule. It just waits until you're vulnerable. The next day, Mason was called into the Human Liaison's quarters, Captain Grant, a lean officer with a voice like static and zero patience for ceremony. I've got 3 requests here, she said, sliding the datapad across the table. 2 from the Zaltari, 1 from Earth Command. Mason leaned forward slowly, careful not to strain his side. Requests for what? You, apparently. He blinked. Why? Grant gave him a look. Kid, you walked into a room of apex warlords, told them you duct-taped a fuel cell into an explosive while you were bleeding out of a lung, and then politely asked to sit down. I think the why has answered itself. Mason rubbed his temples. Can't they just send a thank you card like normal people? Grant didn't smile. First request, the Zaltari want your permission to broadcast your Europa testimony in their war academies. Second, they want your body scan data for research on trauma survivability. Mason recoiled. Wait, they want my body scan? It's anonymized, Grant added, but they're fascinated by how your pulmonary system resisted collapse longer than expected. Something about resilience curves in high-stress environments. I told them to shove it until you gave consent. Mason groaned. What's the third request? Grant tapped her screen. Earth Command wants you to attend a diplomatic summit on Mars next week. Joint panel with the Zaltari. You'll be the human speaker. Symbolic unity. All that nonsense. No, Mason said immediately. Grant raised an eyebrow. That was fast. I just got out of medbay. I still have a hole where a tube used to be. And I'm not giving lectures. You're not. Just sitting in a chair and not offending our lizard friends. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I'll think about it, he said finally. That night, he didn't sleep. He lay in the recovery bunk, staring at the ceiling, one hand pressed against the thick gauze pad on his rib cage. The pain wasn't sharp anymore, just deep and persistent, like a cold ache inside the bone. And the memories were worse. Not of the battle itself, of what came after. He remembered the moment they cut away his uniform, saw the purplish skin under his left arm, how the medic's face changed. He remembered the tremor in his own fingers when they handed him the consent form for emergency thoracic surgery. He remembered waking up and not knowing if he'd still be able to run. Not that he'd be doing much running again anyway. The next morning, Hall returned with the scan results. Nothing's refractured, she said, but the muscle along your flank's still compromised. We're pushing back rehab intensity another week. You'll get clearance to walk unassisted in maybe 10 days. Only walk? Mason asked. Run next month, she said. Lift anything heavier than a backpack? 3 months, minimum, assuming no setbacks. He nodded. Okay. Don't say okay like that, she said. You're frustrated. Of course I'm frustrated. She leaned against the counter. You know, most soldiers your age don't walk away from a lung puncture. Some don't even wake up. I didn't do anything special, he said again. Stop saying that. He looked up sharply. You think being afraid made you weak? It didn't. You moved anyway. You think dragging someone while bleeding internally is standard? It's not. You think being honest about pain makes you fragile? Mason, it's what makes you human. He didn't speak. I'm not trying to inflate your ego, she added. You annoy the hell out of me. But what you did, how you did it, deserves respect. Not from them, from you. He nodded slowly, not quite believing it, but hearing it mattered. By the end of the week, Mason gave formal consent for the war sages to study the anonymized portions of his medical file. He did not consent to the summit. Not yet. Instead, he recorded a message. It wasn't rehearsed, just a single take. He sat in a plain chair, no medals visible. Translator off. Just English. I'm not a symbol, he said. I'm not a legend. I'm a kid from Des Moines who got really lucky after making one hard choice. I didn't plan it. I didn't want it. I just couldn't let them die. That's it. A pause. You want to know what we are? We're the ones who limp away and still go to therapy. We're the ones who drag each other through fire, then argue over whose turn it is to buy coffee when we survive. Another pause. His eyes were glassy now, but steady. We're not built to win. We're built to try again. He sent the file with no fanfare. 2 hours later, the Queen herself transmitted a single line in reply. The court listened still. The transport bay on the Martian Summit Dome was bigger than Mason expected. Everything about the place was designed to impress glossy white walls, crimson banners embroidered with the Zaltari Alliance glyph, and polished metal floors that looked way too clean for a military facility. He wasn't supposed to be there. At least, that's what he told himself, up until the moment the hatch opened and the Queen of the Zaltari stepped through. No guards, no advisors, just her. She crossed the hall on 2 powerful legs, moving with the same effortless grace she had in the throne room. Mason had never seen a Zaltari in a human-style environment before. She looked smaller somehow. Not less imposing, but less alien. Like the gravity here leveled more than just weight. He rose to greet her, stiffly, leaning slightly on the cane Hall had grudgingly allowed him to bring. No exosuit this time. Just a dark dress uniform, clean lines, and that same silver metal gleaming under the Martian lights. You came, he said. I did not expect to, the speaker replied, appearing behind her with the same eerie quiet. But the Queen has questions still. She circled him once, no malice, no threat, just observation. You said in your message, the speaker translated, that humans are not built to win, only to try again. No. Mason nodded once. That phrase is difficult to translate, the speaker added, but she wishes to understand. Mason glanced out the viewport behind them. Beyond the dome, Martian dust swept over the horizon like a slow wave, harsh, unforgiving, and still being conquered. Do you remember what I said about guilt? He asked. How it's heavier than fear? The speaker tilted his head. I wasn't trying to sound brave, Mason continued. There were 4 of us left when the ambush happened. I only got 2 out. He didn't flinch at the memory anymore, but he didn't look proud either. The 3rd Jinn, he was alive when we lifted off. But I knew. I could see it in the medics' faces. They told me to let go, but I didn't. He shifted his weight again, carefully. That's what I carry. Not the pain, not the metal, just that. Knowing I wasn't enough, and trying to live with it anyway. The Queen stood in silence for a long moment. Then, in a motion more ceremonial than personal, she reached to her side and withdrew a narrow object, slender, carved from a pearlescent mineral, etched in lines that pulsed with faint color. The speaker stepped forward and offered it. This is a ceremonial bar of Keth Tara, he said. It is given to warriors who face annihilation and still choose duty. There are only 9 in existence. Now, 10. Keth Tara. Mason didn't take it. Instead, he looked up slowly. I didn't win anything. The queen raised one claw and tapped it gently against her own chest. Then she gestured toward the room, the sky, the summit beyond it. This is not reward, the speaker said. This is burden sharing. Mason stared at the object for another moment, then reached out and took it not with pride, but with the kind of quiet reverence reserved for folded flags and names on memorial walls. 2 hours later, he stood on the summit stage. Not in front of thousands, thankfully. Just a gathering of officials, diplomats, and military personnel, Earth and Zaltari both. The room was still. He wasn't required to speak. But he did anyway. They wanted me to talk about resilience, he said, voice carrying just far enough. But that's not something you describe in a speech. It's something you find in the middle of the worst day of your life, when no one's coming, and no one would blame you for giving up, but you don't. He didn't talk long. Just a few words. He didn't mention the medal, or the explosion, or the surgeries. But when he stepped down from the podium, he noticed something that stopped him short. Several Zaltari warriors, battle-hardened elites, with kill counts that spanned decades, stood with their heads lowered. Not bowed. Not defeated. Just still. Acknowledging something they didn't fully understand, but finally accepted. That night, back aboard the ship, Mason sat alone in the observation deck. His cane rested against the bench. His leg ached, always would, some days worse than others. The ache in his ribs had dulled to a whisper now, like a memory just out of reach. He touched the Kethtara token once, then let it rest in his hand. Footsteps approached. Hall. She didn't say anything at first. Just sat beside him, her gaze scanning the same Martian starscape. You held your breath the whole time, she said eventually. Because I wasn't sure I could say it without breaking. You did. He exhaled. Did I? She turned her head. Mason, you stood in front of beings who literally eat their wounded and made them understand grief. You did more than speak. You translated humanity. He was quiet for a while. Then, do you think they'll ever really get us? No, Hall said. But that's okay, we don't get them either. We just found a place in the middle. He nodded slowly. Somewhere between fear and guilt. Exactly. Weeks later, back on Earth, Mason visited the memorial wall in D.C. It was raining. Quiet. A steady drizzle that soaked the pavement and turned the stone into a mirror. He touched 3 names. Jin. Andrews. Corporal Webb, who he hadn't even known well but remembered screaming when the wall blew apart. He didn't speak. There wasn't anything left to say. But when he turned to leave, a Zaltari emissary was standing under a tree at the edge of the square, alone. No entourage. No announcement. They didn't speak either. But as Mason walked past, the emissary did something unheard of. He crossed his arms over his chest in the human salute. Mason paused, returned the gesture, then kept walking. No one would ever understand everything that happened on Europa. But they understood enough. Enough to never call them weak again. Enough to know that humans weren't terrifying because of their weapons, or their numbers, or even their science. They were terrifying because they kept going. Because when the body failed, they crawled. When the lungs collapsed, they breathed through blood. When the guilt crushed them, they stood again anyway. And even the predators, even the ones born into survival, knew better than to challenge that.